Thank you very much for coming tonight. We're super excited to be hosting Connie Morey. So when I first heard about Connie, I was doing a directed studies in the art education department at UVic for my MA. We're super fortunate at UVic to have an art education department. There aren't a lot of them in universities across Canada, and I was fortunate to be there. And Connie I was pretty excited to hear that she was doing a PhD, a studio-based PhD in that department. And then we crossed paths at the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria, where she taught art classes to youth, and again at the Legacy with her current work related to home. Whenever I see Connie, we always engage in thoughtful dialogue about everyday life and art. And I come away reminded that the two are deeply connected. So it was from those conversations that I realized that she would be a fit to respond to the current Legacy exhibition, Life Stories. Connie Michelle Morey's studio practice explores the experience of home as ecological interdependence. Through site-specific performance, participatory sculptures, photography, and video, her work questions the relationship between ecology, displacement, and belonging. Connie is influenced by childhood experiences living rurally off the land, while being surrounded by family traditions of masonry, construction, and textiles. Her family history commingles settler and Indigenous identities, and her studies in sculpture, ecology, philosophy, post-colonial studies, and art education have all led to her interest in displacement and the politics of marginalization. Connie holds a BFA in Visual Arts from the University of Lethbridge, an MEd in Art Education, and a studio-based PhD from UVic. She currently lives as an uninvited guest on the unceded territories of the Esquimalt and Songhees peoples, where she also teaches community art, sculpture, drawing, and cultural studies at UVic, Vancouver Island University, and Camosun College. So welcome, Connie. It's so great that you're here tonight, that we have you in the community being so involved with art and teaching. And it's been a pleasure getting to know you and working with you over the years, and an honor to host your current work, Hearing Voices at Legacy. So I'm just going to turn it over to you, Connie. I think you're muted.
Okay, thank you, Gillian. I'm really delighted to be here. Welcome, everyone. I am accessing the talk from the unceded territories of the Lekwungen and Wasanik peoples, and I'm so grateful to be here. I wanted to begin by thanking Gillian, who I've had the pleasure of working on Hearing Voices with quite closely from sort of the early development of it. And I also wanted to thank the team at Legacy Gallery and at UVic for their enthusiasm and their support, and David Holloway for his support following me around with the camera while I walked rather quickly through the streets of Victoria. And thank you also to everybody who is here and has entered the virtual world to be with us tonight. So today I'm going to share a little bit about Hearing Voices and other work, recent work that intersects with the project. I'll begin by sharing some images and some video, and I'm looking forward to your questions and having a conversation with you after I provide some context and background to the work. So I'm just going to pull up my screen and do a screen share here and make sure that you guys can see it. We're good. Okay, so Hearing Voices is a project that has involved me walking with sculpture or carrying sculpture on my back while walking throughout downtown Victoria. The simple acts of walking and carrying are important to the work, and I'll explain a bit more about that after. The sculpture consists of a backpack that is made out of an assemblage of outbuildings or lean-tos that are made out of select photographs that are from places that are often referred to as abandoned spaces. These photographs are a small selection of some of the 41 abandoned places that I've traveled to since 2019 on the east and west coasts of Canada. Oops, I'm just gonna go back because I'm on the wrong slide here. Here we go. There we go. My work grows out of my own mixed settler and Indigenous identity, and as someone who carries with me the responsibilities that accompany white privilege, but it also grows out of my own struggles with poverty and class. For some time now, my studio work has explored issues related to displacement. And I'd like to begin by saying that the foremost act of displacement in this country is the displacement of Indigenous peoples from their homelands by settler communities. I'd also like to say that through my work traveling to displace fishing, logging, and mining villages and industry sites, on the east and west coast of Canada, I've come to notice that cycles of displacement seem to be an identifying characteristic of settler culture. And I'll share more on my thoughts and experiences with that as we continue. But for now, I'd like to share some images that sort of provide some background to hearing voices. I'd like to begin with a very short video. I think it's about 2 minutes long, and it shows where some of the images that are on the backpack come from. And in the video where they exist, I've included both Indigenous and settler place names. However, in Newfoundland, Indigenous place names for places like St. John's, Bonavista, Port Union, and Trinity Bay no longer exists because the Beothuk, the original peoples of the area, are now extinct, and with it, their language is also largely extinct. So I'm just going to show the video that has the background images on it, gives some context. Oops, I'm going to. So the video provides a bit of context for some of the places that are included on the backpack. When Gillian and I spoke about the work being a response to Life Stories, which is the exhibition that's currently up at Legacy, I spent some time thinking about the stories that are present in many of the spaces that I visited. I thought about how many of the space sites are considered abandoned, vacant or empty, but when I've visited them, I've really been quite overwhelmed by the abundance of life in the spaces. The place has made me aware of the voices of life in the acts of nature, reclaiming buildings, healing the ground, and returning materials that come from the earth back to the earth, and in the voices presence in an abundance of graffiti in many of the sites, some of it from individuals giving voice, and some I felt wanting to be heard in a safe way. Evidence of the presence of people, of history, of longing, in that longing is a word that is connected to belonging, and evidence of displacement, and with nature's presence, reclamation. My intention with the project is not so much of a performance per se, but more of an encounter. The word performance, even though it's been stretched, I think, in the visual arts, sort of to the boundaries of its meaning, to the general public, it generally means an event with an audience. And when I was thinking about the walks as more of an encounter than a performance, I was interested in the idea of an encounter because there's less variables that are in my control when I encounter experiences than when I perform a single event for an audience. And because of this, it felt like there were more opportunities for me to sort of listen and be responsive through the walks. There were 3 walks in total. The first 2 were an hour each, and the last one was 2 hours. All of them were in downtown Victoria, and the last one took us into James Bay. I purposely explored spaces that are overlooked as part of the project, so back alleys, parking lots, less sort of valued or visible spaces, but I also wanted to be visible as a way to engage others. I thought about bringing sculpture in a public sphere in sort of a safe way, but a somewhat quiet way during the pandemic, and how doing this might offer an opportunity to open or connect with others at a time when we've been really unusually insular. The encounters that I had were varied. Each one felt to me like a way to understand the way that we engage as humans, our vulnerabilities and our needs. Some people would look and then look away. I said, I think, to David a number of times about there being a rule about not staring at the weirdo. Others would smile. I had one gentleman who followed me across the street for well over a block with a big grin on his face. Some people would comment. One boy laughed out loud. People would notice from their cars, and some people would slow down to engage, which worried me a little bit because they're supposed to be driving. Others stopped to ask questions and share their thoughts on the work, or ask me about it. Or about the backpack itself. People were really interested in what was on the backpack. Some people shared where they came from and what their experiences were, and some people shared their experiences during the pandemic. I had a brief card with me with information about the project that I carried for people who seemed hesitant to engage but were curious. On the third walk, I walked with the sculpture into James Bay, where I noticed that people tend to walk a bit slower there and drive a bit slower, and more people responded there. After a couple of hours of walking, we stopped for lunch with the backpack, and most of the staff and the customers in the restaurant came over to engage and ask about the work. People seemed to me genuinely appreciative of the work. The sculpture felt a little bit like times when my kids were younger and I had a baby in a stroller, a baby with me. It was like a little bit of a living connection device that helped people to engage and talk during a time when we're used to really not engaging with each other very much. So I not only had encounters with people, but also with buildings, with myself, with refuse. I had a lot of encounters with gated alleys. There's a lot of gated alleys in Victoria. Experienced encounters with history, with graffiti, and because of my own interest, I noticed how much moss there was on a lot of buildings and spaces. My thoughts about the project, they're still evolving. They're informed by my process of engaging with the project and also by my past work. And I'd like to share a little bit of the impetus for the work. So work that helped to inform it or that made me want to build the sculpture in the first place. And especially two other projects that I've been involved in the last 2 years and I'm still engaged with. One of them is called Project Homestick and the other one is the Breathing Wall. The Breathing Wall is a project that I worked on with artist Taryn Walker and curator Michelle Jakes. The work on the Breathing Wall involved sort of me exploring what I think of as the illusion of separation that sometimes propagates acts of displacement, our separation from ourselves and our separation from nature. It explored our relationship with each others and our relationship with the natural world as sort of a sentient breathing membrane. And this work here is one of the works from the Breathing Wall. It's titled Release and it's 10 freestanding sculptures that are made out of recycled wool blankets, surplus World War II gas masks that I ordered from the Czech Republic. And when they came, they smelled like they'd been in somebody's basement for a very long time. So the sculptures still have a little bit of that smell to them. And they're also made out of reclaimed wood, which is a material that I've been working with. The recycled wool blankets and the reclaimed wood are materials that I've been working with for a while. This next work from the Breathing Wall is titled Learning to Breathe or Failing, Learning to Breathe. And it's a stop motion that I started during that time, but I'm still working on. And the next slide shows a close-up image of it. That work was really me thinking about human attempts to heal and me traveling to all these abandoned spaces and the act of us wanting to heal nature or heal the land. And often the way that we engage with that is short-sighted or mixed with other motives. So we do things like plant one tree to replace a whole ecosystem. And so in the stop motion, I have a bucket full of moss and I am climbing up and down a ladder and attempting to cover or restore an abandoned home with moss, which is a organism that naturally heals the earth. So it creates soil and helps other species to grow. And most of the moss just falls down repeatedly. So I climb up and down the ladder and up and down the ladder. So it's a work that, and actually images from this house are also on the backpack as well. And it's a work that I'm still engaged with. The last piece from the Breathing Wall that I think informed the work with hearing voices is the work that's on the left. So the image from the left is what was in the exhibition, The Breathing Wall. It's titled The Space Between You and Me. And for it, when I was collaborating with Taryn and Michelle on The Breathing Wall, there was a lot going on in the States, a lot of talk about building walls to keep people out in the States. And I really wanted to build this tiny porous wall that showed our interdependence. It wasn't a big concrete wall, and it wasn't something that separated and divided us, but was this almost ironically flimsy little wall. So it started with the pieces, me crocheting these really porous walls that also resembled moss or lichen. And then that work has extended into a larger piece that includes, that I've been collaborating on with my mom, that includes an installation of 80 pieces of this crocheted moss and a video work with her that's about to be installed in a couple days at Comox Valley Art Gallery. So these works from the Breathing Wall are indebted to research and communication with Anishinaabe biologist Robin Wall Kimmerer and her work on moss and her advocacy for the personhood of all living things. I think Robin Wall Kimmerer's work has really helped me to understand that natural places are often thought of as abandoned or empty spaces, but they're really full of agency and personhood. And we tend to want to define agency in spaces if they are human spaces or if they are managed by human systems of management. So Robin Wall Kimmerer's work intersects with Vandana Shiva's work, which I'm also interested in, particularly her work to create a human rights as the declaration of the rights of all things on the earth. And I think we have a hard time exploiting the environment and displacing ourselves and other living beings if we understood that human rights were entwined with the rights of all living things. Another project that I'd like to mention that Hearing Voices grows out of, and perhaps more intimately, is Project Homestick. And just prior to beginning Project Homestick, I made this work, which actually was exhibited at Legacy Gallery for a faculty show there. Project Homestick is a project that began in spring 2019. And at that time, or just prior to that time, I was experiencing a very stressful situation with housing security. As an artist who has been committed to my practice and a single mother, and somebody who's often working multiple part-time sessional jobs to make ends meet, I went through a stretch where I was very concerned about not having enough income for food or for rent each month. I was afraid that I might end up without housing for myself and my daughter. During that time, looking in the cupboard or having my daughter tell me that we were out of things was really, really stressful. It was a highly stressful time. So I started to make art about it to process it. The first work that I made was Cushion, and then I wrote a grant for Project Homestick. I felt really vulnerable speaking about my situation. So it was, especially formally, it was really hard at that time for me to speak about it. I felt some shame and some judgment, I think socially, a bit from my family, and also my own expectations for myself. And about that time, I had been sharing a studio with a friend and mentor, Barb Hunt. And she encouraged me to write about the connection between Project Homesick and my struggles with poverty and housing insecurity. And I found a way to write about it that felt safe to me, and submitted the proposal and received the grant. So in July 2019, I began to make a portable, collapsible roof to take with me as I traveled as far from home as I could while still being in Canada. And in August 2019, I traveled to the east coast of Newfoundland to displaced village sites with the portable, collapsible roof over my head. Actually, I put it in a big portfolio case and took it on a plane. And then when I was there, I unpacked it and put it over my head. So I had met a couple of people prior to going to Newfoundland that made me feel drawn to it. Barb Hunt was one of those people. She had worked at the Grenfell campus of Memorial University. And then the other was my partner, David, who grew up around Deer Lake area. And because of that, I was aware of the extensive number of displaced or resettled villages in Newfoundland due to federal mismanagement of the fishing industry. And I packed up the roof to photograph myself sort of migrating through the villages as a form of research to help me think through, what does it mean to have home? What does it mean to belong? What does it mean to be displaced? Which were things that I was already thinking about in terms of housing insecurity. So the first image, actually, I'll just go back. The first image is of Port Union, which is it's a site that's actually in the process of being restored. But this image right here is an area that hasn't started restoration yet. And it's the first Fishermen's Union town on the East Coast in Newfoundland. And then this is after I came back to Victoria and I started to travel up the West Coast. And this is in the Comox Valley. It is, I believe it's mine number 1. And this is a slag heap, which is the coal that is left over from the mining process. So after returning to Victoria, I began traveling up the West Coast to displaced industry and village sites. And I spent some time in the Comox Valley at a residence at Comox, an artist residency at Comox Valley Art Gallery. And then I traveled to Campbell River. I traveled around the Cowichan Valley and the west side of the island. And I spent some time around the CRD. And in November, I'll return to Newfoundland again for a residency at in St. John's to continue the work. So I'm really looking forward to that. Over the last 2 years, as I traveled to places where communities have been resettled or displaced, I began to see patterns of displacement as what I think of as an identifying characteristic of settler culture. In most of these places, the places are referred to as abandoned rather than displaced. And I began to wonder over the time spent traveling there, if it's a coincidence that displacement patterns occur in cultures where people view themselves as disconnected, either disconnected from place, separate independent individuals, separate species. And I began to see this view of competitive independence as sort of propagating acts of displacement against ourselves and against others. Each industry site that I visited on both coasts was built on displaced Indigenous land that was viewed as abandoned, or a term that many of us are familiar with, which is terra nullius, which means no man's land or an empty land. And each settler village that was displaced was built for an industry that viewed the land as empty, as if it was not already being occupied and the home of many sentient species. Near each industry site that I visited, there was usually a village or villages where settlers had also displaced other settlers, usually the poorest among them. Working class laborers, miners, fishers, and loggers are displaced by an industry, it seems, that operates on an ideology of separation, of not belonging to the earth, or not dependent on it or others. And to me, it's as if what Vandana Shiva says, that we think that the forest and the field do not meet. So hearing voices is about, for me, I guess, thinking about the voices that exist in places of displacement, places that are often overlooked, viewed as abandoned, unoccupied, unmanaged, or available for settler exploitation or use. And through the work, I've been exploring how displacement seems to be an identifying ideology impacting socioeconomic systems of engagement in settler culture in Canada. I'm still really engaged in the practice, and I'll return to Newfoundland in November, as I mentioned before, to continue it. And in the summer of 2022, so just over a year, or just a little bit more than a year from now, I'll show the body of work, Roof Over My Head, at Legacy Gallery. So I'm really looking forward to that, because I get to continue collaborating on the project and with the folks at Legacy. So I'm just going to stop the share, and I'm looking forward to having some questions from you guys.
Thanks, Connie. That was great. Beautiful images, and yeah, interesting to have a kind of a tour of both coasts and some of the abandoned spaces, and taking us there with your engagement. So what we're going to do now is I have a couple of questions, but we're also welcoming questions from the audience. So please either put your Zoom hand up, you can put your hand up on your screen, or you can chat your questions. Yeah, it would be nice if people feel comfortable turning their videos on. I kind of like to see people's faces and see who's here, but no pressure. Hi, Mike. Just because I miss being in the legacy with everybody there. So we'll be looking for questions, and yeah, I'll start. Connie, we talked a little bit about this before, but thinking about in relation to your work with moss in the Breathing Wall project, and I know you said that you were noticing the moss in your walks in hearing voices. And you said that nature can teach us how to engage with the world. And I'm interested in that. I'm wondering what you've learned through your practice, your art practice, or these projects around how to engage with the world, and how you might have brought that to the Hearing Voices project.
I think what I notice, or what I'm interested in terms of what nature offers us, is sort of really about our systems of relating. Like in the case of moss, I think it provides models for relationships, for economies, for diversity, for labor systems. Moss has really been a big interest for me because it's something that I guess through research, I've discovered that it's something that holds space for all other species. It creates soil, and it helps other species to grow. Even when it takes sunlight or water from the earth, it reciprocates and gives back. So it doesn't engage in a system of competitive individualism or planned obsolescence. In depleted industry sites, moss is often one of the first things that can grow. So it can grow in tailings, and it creates soil for other plants to take root, and humans benefit from the labor of moss. So I've been thinking about moss and different organisms that exist in nature as providing us a model for economies and for labor, which are things that I think are really individually based in our culture. And I think that moss, the economy or the labor of moss, is one of reciprocity and healing for the whole planet. So that to me is really inspiring. So in terms of how I take that, what I've learned from nature or brought into hearing voices, I guess in hearing voices, I want to acknowledge that interdependence and a process rather than the backpack's sort of built as a human organism. It's a built structure, so it's human structures, but they're all built together as if they're dependent on and interconnected with one another. So in a way, it both looks like it's human, it's referencing human, but it also looks like an organism, or for me, I think of it as an organism. And the acts of walking and carrying are acts of labor. So really interested in those as sort of performative acts. What happens when we carry things with us, or walking and carrying are sort of performative or labor acts that aren't really that harmful. You know, if I carry something with my body, or I'm sort of using my body in a similar way that birds build nests, or bears engage, or other species engage, it feels like a form of labor where I can engage that perhaps feels less harmful. So I think that's where I'm thinking about nature in terms of teaching us, but I'm also really aware of the context that I come from. That I come from a culture that is sort of it's saturated with ideologies of sort of competitive independence, and I don't think I can escape that. So I on one hand, I'd be really hesitant to say that I'm a good student of nature, because I feel like we're really babies, you know, like we're just of the younger brothers and sisters of nature. Settler culture is like a fetus or something is what I feel. So there's a lot of systemic limitations that we bring to learning from or understanding that make it really hard for us to engage as open learners, I guess. Yeah.
Thanks. I'm thinking about how I might see moss the next time as a hardworking healer and get inspiration from that. We have a question from Jaiya. Thanks for your question, Jaiya. And she says, thank you for your compelling talk and work. What role do materials play in each of your work, especially the fiber textile pieces? So what role do materials play?
I think materials, as a sculptor especially, materials are really important. I think materials are your body and materials are some of the first things that you communicate with and understand as somebody who attempts to engage with or think about the world and communicate through art. I spend a lot of time thinking about materials and sort of where they come from. And the materials that I work with, and examples, the backpacks made out of like paper, and I'm always thinking, if I was to cover it with resin, it would be really waterproof and easy to carry through the streets, but doing that would make it like permanent and it couldn't be taken apart. And so the recycled wool blankets, wool's a material that I feel pretty close to and I've used a lot. I like it because I can see really easily where wool comes from. I understand the process of how it's developed. I understand sort of how it goes back to the land. The reclaimed blankets, there's a number of reasons that I use those in the way that I think about them. But part of them is that, one is that I've often been in a situation where I don't have a lot of money. And so there is this practical consideration that, I just put a shout out to a bunch of friends that I need a certain material. And if it's used, it comes to me. But that reality of me not having much is also one that helps me to use materials sort of wisely. So it's a limitation that sort of propels me in a particular direction. And the same with reclaimed woods. I've often built, different size structures out of reclaimed wood. So those materials of recycling rather than using new materials is something that I think about, and also in terms of what the materials communicate because of where they come from or what their history is. Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah.
Okay, I have another question. So we asked you to respond to the Life Stories exhibition or do the work in relation to that. And I'm wondering about how you see the stories from the abandoned spaces in relation to the Life Stories exhibition or to the stories in the Life Stories exhibition.
I think that, well, honestly, when I went through the Life Stories exhibition, there were so many things that I'm really interested in that exhibition. I was really interested in the childhood. There's a quote on the wall, I can't remember what it is, but there's a section on childhood objects, and they made me think of things that age and process and the process of time. So I was interested in that because that's something that those abandoned spaces have in them. There's photographs of people that don't look made up, and I can't remember the name of the photographer, Frank
Pimentel?
Yes, the photographs that they just look like people in everyday situations where the people aren't apologetic for being real. And I feel like the spaces, the abandoned spaces, have that element of not being made up, that they are what they are. And even some of the spaces that I traveled through with the backpack, like I think a place that feels like it's got the most to say is sort of between Fiskard and Herald, where the Volvo repair shop is behind there. There's like some garbage cans and some a side of a building and moss growing all over it. And I just think, oh, this is a parking lot. And often we would think a parking lot, we pass over it and it just feels like it has so much voice. There's so much it says about us. There's so much that it says about what we think is important, about what spaces need to be reserved for who. So in terms of the exhibition, how does the backpack, I guess I saw a number of different intersections with the work, and also hearing voices, perhaps speaking to some of the underlying themes that you might not see right away in the work that's exhibited in life spaces, but is still part of those stories, if that makes sense.
Thank you. So we have a couple of questions here from the audience, comments and questions. So Heidi says, although very different, Connie, I can't help but think of the flaneur in the 19th century, a reinvention, of course, but this idea of the wanderer. A definition of that traditionally depicted as male, a flaneur is an ambivalent figure of urban affluence and modernity, representing the ability to wander detached from society with no other purpose than to be an acute observer of industrialized contemporary life. More of a comment than a question.
Okay, so very interesting. I don't know. I mean, I recently have come across that and been thinking about it, but I don't know a lot about the history. But that idea of wandering is interesting. I often think about wandering as part of my, the studio practice itself, in terms of it being uncovered as I go, but I don't really think of it in terms of the walks for hearing voices as much, although I guess there would be some overlap in terms of my privilege, my privilege and the privilege that is described with that character. I think there's some overlap there that would be good to be real about. Yeah.
It's interesting. I mean, this is all new for me as well, your project. But I think with the flaneur, there's a sense of the flaneur taking things in. And I think that as they flan, as they move around the city, and I think that that's what you're doing, but also you are offering something back by carrying the backpack on your back. You are being a larger presence than you would normally be, I think, when you're just being a flaneur. So there's a different element to your work, I think.
I think the maybe offering something back is through the encounter, is what I think. There's some element of me engaging with others through it. I'm actually not someone who likes a lot of it. I don't mind being social or in a social environment, but I don't like a lot of attention placed on me. But somehow I'm able to walk, because I feel like I'm just representing a sculpture and it doesn't become about me. I'm able to walk and do that and engage with people, and it feels really easy. Whereas if I was to perform like a spectacle where everybody was looking at me and I was responsible for everybody in that would be a little bit harder for me to do. But I think the encounter is something that feels like an opportunity to listen and reciprocate. I ended up with an encounter with an unhoused gentleman, and he wanted to follow for quite a long time, and I ended up having to think about the conversation and at what moments did I want to leave, and a lot of biases that I might have that I wasn't aware of. And so that and other encounters are, or whether I agreed with his views on the pandemic, like all these sorts of things I had to actually go through and process and say, how do I make space for that? Like if I'm holding space, how do I hold space for situations, and that it's a man might make me slightly more uncomfortable than if I was engaging with a woman. Like how do I do that as I'm walking? So there was a lot of reflection on what does it really mean to hold space when things are not going to unfold as you want them to, or how you might imagine them them to unfold. Yeah.
Interesting that it's as much about the encounters and people as it is about the abandoned spaces. We do have two more, well, a question in the chat, and Mike, Emmy would like to ask a question, and Erin. So I'll just put it to you, Mike. Do you have a question still? And I'll ask you to unmute.
Hi, yes. First of all, thank you for this, Connie. It's great to see your work, and you've been wandering across my Facebook for some time now, so I'm excited to see the work and hear you talk about it. I have a bunch of little question fragments that come out of a first impression of the backpack, actually. When I saw it, I immediately thought of the favelas in Rio de Janeiro, where, for a lot of different reasons, many of them oppressive, people build on each other, right? And there are that kind of housing around the world for different circumstances. So between your walks and your photography to all these different places, you made a decision to bring all these spaces together, which might be an act of curation, might be an act of healing, might be, I imagine, the people in those buildings being able to hear through the thin walls and hear each other. So I think that really does fit the theme of the show as well. But ultimately, I'd be interested in, I mean, you've talked about it a little bit, so maybe you don't need to say anything more, but the choice to bring all these buildings together was, a big decision on your part that changes those buildings. So any thoughts about why, how, even the notion of curation, would you use that word? Or would that word in some ways violate what you've done?
I think we're always curating. I mean, whenever we make an artwork, we curate it. It would be, whenever we post something on Facebook, we curate it. Like, we're always curating things. And I think we're better off to acknowledge that we're doing it. I think there's a lot of things, Mike, in the way the backpack's constructed that I'm still understanding that I don't understand. I know that for a long time, I've been really drawn to this sort of like the way that they're connected together. I've often thought of it, and I'm sure because we've had many conversations before that you would already be aware of this component. I've thought of it as this idea of interdependence and this organism. I think when people live together, often in difficult circumstances, they live in a much more meshed together way because there's a lack of choice. And so I'm not sure how much that plays into it. I do know that I had a lot of conversations about what spaces I would visit while carrying the backpack, what people I would photograph or not photograph, how I can see the way that we operate as sort of separate individuals as impacting, it's had an impact on me in terms of housing insecurity, but I've never been homeless myself. And I spent a lot of time discussing and thinking about the homeless population and how it's something that's really close to my heart, and that I feel I'm also in the neighborhood of what's going on in Beacon Hill Park and often hear the conversations about it. But also am aware that it's not my story to tell. So how do I hold space for that? And but I'm aware that the work, because it deals with, in a way, these displaced places and settler culture, a sort of current, the way that we operate socioeconomically in settler culture, just seems to engage these acts of displacement, which ultimately also impact class and the homeless population. So when you talk about the favelas and things, I think about that as well. So it's part of my thought process, but I'm still very much figuring that out. I'm like often engaged in conversations around it, both publicly and privately, but I'm really still figuring it out myself. I'm trying to figure out how to hold space without speaking for other people, I think. Yeah. I don't know if that answers. I hope it in some way, yeah, it's in the ballpark. Yeah.
Thanks, Connie. Erin, do you have a question you'd like to ask?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Gillian. And hi, Connie. Thank you.
Hi.
It's nice to encounter you on Zoom here tonight. I really enjoyed your talk, and I'm very grateful that you are part of our exhibition in terms of responding and widening and diversifying perspectives on life stories. So very, very grateful. Thank you so much. And I just wanted to make, I've kind of been scribbling notes here, and I just wanted to make a couple of comments and ask a question. I think your exploratory methodology, your idea of walking and listening, encountering, in a way describes our curatorial process. In a sense, Gillian's laughing. We kind of wandered through this vast collection, not really knowing what we were going to encounter. And there was a lot of chance, chaos, spontaneity, and unexpected things emerged, and relationships we hadn't anticipated, conversations we hadn't anticipated. And I don't think I revealed to the legacy up front just how much of a process that was going to be in terms of the unexpected. And because we're meant to be really organized as we go about curatorial work often. And so I'm just confessing that now. But I was really struck by the sort of the recuperative healing aspects of your project. And it's almost like we need someone like you wandering, listening through every community across the country, although that would keep you very busy. And what really, I guess, struck me most because comes out of a recent experience I've had in traveling around the more northern parts of the island, looking for communities for family members to settle in, and feeling a sense of communities displaced, and feeling a sense of pain and displacement as industry has left, and people feeling, I don't know, this is just a sense I get, trying to reorganize their lives around something meaningful that isn't emerging. And I don't want to name communities, in case people are really fond of them and they're going to protest against that. But I really hear you about this sense of people searching, all kinds of people, diverse people, searching for some sense of connection and renewal, recuperative healing. And so I wondered how you feel going forward with your project. Is there a sense that you can assist in this process by documenting and walking and reconnecting? Can you reconnect through your work people to place, for example? Or
Yeah, that's a question I've thought about, Erin. That's wow, that's a big question. I think, like, I do think, like, I'm often thinking of a quote from Simone Weil, which says that a fixed point of view is the root of injustice. And when we engage in conversations, or we open up dialogue, or we offer something that engages people and helps them to look from a different perspective, I think those conversations have the potential to heal. They don't always do that. So I think talking about those things openly and vulnerably has the potential to heal. And I think art does have the potential to do that if it's accessible. One of the things I like about the project is that it brings art out of the gallery into spaces with people who otherwise might not enter the gallery or be used to it. So that feels like something that engages the potential for conversations that might not exist otherwise. I'm really cautious to say that my work is healing or make a definitive statement about it, because I just think human beings have so many limitations. I think Gabor Mate says that human beings are the most dependent among the species. We need our parents the longest and we depend the most on the environment, but we're also the most arrogant among the species. We think that we know more than everything else, or more intelligent than everything else. So because I belong to that big category, I'm not sure I'd love for my work to be involved in a process of healing. It's definitely what I'm interested in, and it's what I think about. But yeah, I have privilege and limitations, and I belong to a culture that it's not doing that well. Is what I think in terms of healing. It's I think there's lots of people making effort, but there's layers of systemic issues at play, I think. Anyways, I hope that answers it. Thank you, Erin. I really appreciated hearing about your process.
Okay, thank you. We have 2 questions in the chat, and then it'll be close to time, I think. Amber says, thank you for speaking about how poverty impacts your creative practice. Housing and food insecurity are precarious at best for many, and it's getting worse every day. I appreciate your thoughts on the topic. You mentioned patterns of displacement and exploring abandoned spaces, and this reminds me of the landscape of the prairies and your education in southern Alberta. Have you explored the empty dwellings there, or did you engage with, sorry, I'm losing this a bit, with them when you lived there?
When I lived, I actually, Amber, grew up in Ontario, and then when I was a teenager, I went to Alberta and did, as you know, I did my BFA at the University of Lethbridge. I can say, I don't know, I'd have to think back to think about what sort of spaces I engaged with when I was in Alberta. I've been interested in returning. I know that there's spaces, a lot of spaces that would speak differently. There's often a bit of a divide between BC and industries in Alberta. And I'm really interested in something that Robert Smithson said about how the artist can sort of be a mediator between sort of nature and, you know, some kind of advocacy for nature and understanding what happens with the miner, or in this case, people that work in the oil industry. So I'm interested in how we tend to like really sort of do the separation again, like them and us, or, you know, like we're not, and it makes us feel a little bit better about ourselves. But I'm really, I think I'm interested in understanding more about that. I'd love to go back. I'd love to extend the work into Alberta and think more about it. But I'm not sure about what's happened in the past. That would probably be a process where I'd have to think and sit and let the ideas come to me of what has happened that's influenced it. But there's no doubt there must be some influence. Definitely the working class. My interest in working class industry and labor comes both from my experience in Ontario and in Alberta, and coming from a family that's really a working class, you know, where my dad was a laborer, and yeah. Oh, you're muted, Gillian.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So Erin just wanted to add a comment. Maybe tell Connie it is a methodology for healing that you offer, and that was actually one of the questions that I was going to ask about healing. So I think we can all kind of maybe hold that from the work that we've seen. I don't know if maybe you want to speak a bit to that, how you're, I don't know, what is this healing that happens? Is it healing for you? Is it healing for the spaces you're in? Where's the healing happening?
I don't know that I can say that healing's happening. I really don't know that I can say that's the case. I'm not sure that's the statement that I'm making. I'm thinking about and questioning how we might heal.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there, it's an interest for sure. And definitely, you know, after hearing me talk about the issues I'm interested in, it's kind of evident that that's like an undercurrent to it.
I think that there's an element of sorry to interrupt, an element of mindfulness in your work. And I think that that kind of mindfulness can be a way for us to start to heal our relationships with others, spaces, places, beings, plants.
Yeah, I think listening and being attentive and engaging with conversations in really genuine, open ways feels like good stuff always comes out of that. Like it just like whatever comes seems to make sense. It's very similar to the art process for me. It's one of the few processes that I engage with where I don't really feel that much control, even though I make all the things. It's like an idea comes and then it starts to unfold and then something else. And there's very little stress involved. It's like, oh, this is just going to come together. It's just like, oh, yeah, this is just going to come together. And so that sense of sort of being attentive and just watching a process unfold, that feels sort of similar to the way that nature happens. It just unfolds. And you pay attention to what's going on. And by paying attention, you understand it with more clarity than if you get in the way, I think. But I guess, yeah, so I guess I agree with you, Gillian, that those processes of paying attention and being mindful and listening. And I also think conversing, like I think when we talk to each other, somebody else butts up against you and says, are you sure about that? Or that idea makes me really uncomfortable, or can you stop talking about that? and then you sort of reflect and are challenged. So I think conversations are a big part of it too, which is why the encounters feel kind of important to the work, because they do also challenge me. And I think anytime that we are opened up in a way that feels positive, or maybe is some form of healing, that's good for everybody, because we're all intertwined. We're like all stuck together, I think.
Caroline wanted to ask you about the graffiti. She said she was interested in your reflections around moss and abandoned buildings. Do you have thoughts or further reflections on the graffiti that overtakes so many of the abandoned spaces that you visited and photographed?
Yeah, the graffiti's really powerful, and I don't think, like, the aesthetics is one part of it. You know, you look at it and you say, wow, these people, you know, there's skill going on here. But the text-based graffiti is, there's like a lot of the text-based graffiti has that I've come across has expressed things that just like say so much about us. Like, okay, people wanting to say profanities all the time speaks about what's allowed and what's not allowed, or taboos, or where are safe spaces for me to just let things out. I've come across, you know, there's one site that I came across where the text, people may have seen this before, like on my Instagram or something, where it's placed and it says, I miss my friend Gerard a lot. And I was like, okay, that's like a real moment of vulnerability where I can say that in this space, but I can't say it someplace else. Or, you know, so-and-so is like, you know, something really negative about somebody, but it's like a sort of almost like a raw expression of emotion where you have a place to actually be able to speak. And a lot of times graffiti, not always, but a lot of times it's done by youth, and there's less visible spaces. You know, they're still often under the authority of adults, and to be able to actually speak about what's happening in their world is sort of major. And yeah, so the graffiti feels really powerful. It is like an abundance of human presence that isn't managed. It's not managed human presence. And most of the spaces that are referred to as abandoned are really places that are not managed by anthropocentric systems of management. So that's a space where there's this sense of freedom, I think. Yeah, the graffiti's pretty, I think, telling in some ways, right? Not that I could say 1 + 1 = 2, but that on some level it really speaks to you about, I think, human vulnerabilities and needs. Yeah.
And life stories.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, well, I think we're going to wrap it up now. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, and everyone for being here. It was really wonderful to see how you've been thinking through your Hearing Voices project, Connie, and we look forward to working with you again in the future. I would also like to thank Legacy's Amy Smith for your help with the production of tonight's event, and Dee Kearns from UVic AV Services for your guidance and solid support behind the scenes. So Zoom events always take more work than it seems. So I really appreciate both of your help with that. And thanks everyone for joining tonight. We're going to be putting a link up in the chat right now. It's there. If you wouldn't mind taking a moment to fill out a very short survey on programming at Legacy, it helps us to figure out what we're going to do next. And Erin has a question, looks like. Get your hand up, Erin, on purpose.
It was my clapping hands. Thank you.
Oh, clapping hands.
Thank you very
Yes.
much.
I think everybody's hands are clapping. Thank you, Connie, and thank you, Erin. And I just wanted to add that Life Stories is open until April 10th. So please come and visit us Wednesday to Saturday, 10 to 4. We have COVID protocol in play, so easy to visit, safe to visit. And on April 21st, we open a new exhibition on beaded ground, Indigenous beading, which will run through the summer. So keep an eye out on our website for more artist talks and workshops over the summer. So thank you all for coming. It's really great to see you and hear from you, and we look forward to seeing you in person, hopefully sometime soon.